Circumcision. Here's what I had to say. In section 1, we read in Genesis 17 how God commanded Abraham to be circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. God also commanded 8-day-old baby boys to be circumcised later on in the book of Leviticus. Circumcision was a command of God, so the Jews rightly took it seriously, as they do with all of God's commandments. From a practical application perspective, speaking of circumcision, we Jews do not believe that the laws come to an end in Messiah. Therefore, we still practice infant circumcision right down to this day. Circumcision pointed towards the promise of God, that he would bless Abraham with many descendants, culminating in the quintessential son of Abraham, Yeshua the Messiah. And that sentence there that talks about what circumcision pointed towards, you can see that if you go back and read through the Genesis narrative, starting in about, say, chapter 12 and working your way through, say, chapter 17, and read those and notice the progression of events leading up to Abraham becoming circumcised and Abraham's believing in the Lord and God counting it or crediting it to his account as righteous in Genesis 15:6. All of that is a very good way, in my opinion, to understand that circumcision is pointing to the promise of multiplicity, the promise of blessing, the promise of increasing the offspring through the chosen son of Abraham, the promised son of Abraham, which from Abraham's perspective naturally pointed to Isaac, but spiritually pointed to Yeshua. Make sense? Okay. So circumcision is that outward sign of an inward promise, an outward sign of an inward reality, a promise of the inheritance. And that's actually what Paul says in Galatians. So, circumcision pointed towards that by remaining loyal to the Brit Milah, the covenant of circumcision, which is what Brit Milah means here. The covenant of circumcision, male members of Israel were signaling their continued reliance not upon the flesh, the member of procreation, to bring about God's promises in their lives, but instead they were demonstrating their continued dependency upon the miracle working power of the Lord Almighty to enact blessings in their lives. Make sense? So, now that we know that that's what that circumcision points to, even though Messiah has now already come, historically, circumcision still serves as a reminder that all who wish to be counted among Abraham's genuine and lasting children must appropriate the same faith as Abraham had. That is, faith in the promised word of the Lord, end quote. And that quote is essentially the way that Paul interacts with the narrative in the book of Galatians. Remember, I like to imagine that in his preparation for to writing the book of Galatians, Paul went back through the he went back through the Genesis narrative again, particularly the story that I suppose starts in, say, Genesis 12 and ends about in, say, Genesis 17, 18, somewhere around there. Read through those chapters and start to begin to appreciate Abraham interacting with God's promise of multiplicity, to bring about a lot of children, the promise of progeny, but also Abraham's interaction with Hagar and with Sarah and with circumcision, and specifically in Genesis 15, Abraham's dialogue or interaction with God over the word of the Lord. So, and it's faith in the promised word of the Lord. Faith in the promised word of the Lord, not faith in the flesh, not faith in his circumcision, not faith in his ethnicity, not faith in his good works.